Hey guys, can anyone hear me?
Yes.
Hello. Yeah, I just wait a minute or two, maybe a few more people will come. Let me find the Hegel. Okay, I guess I should get started. I'm not very impressed with the attendance. I mean, should I start taking attendance? I mean, it's quite, with a class with almost 80 students in, this is yeah, it's not very good. Okay, so we're talking about Hegel, and Hegel is actually really hard. So I think one thing about Hegel is Hegel's someone who, if you just go off and try and read it by yourself, it's not the easiest thing to do. So who read the introduction? Who's finished? How did you find it? Could you understand it?
I mean, when you talk about it, yeah. I can make sense, but it needs to be translated with with you, yeah.
And I think one problem with Hegel is Hegel himself says, you know, his philosophy can't be understood. It can only be thought. Yeah. So if you think you've understood it, you've made a mistake, because it can't be understood, because understanding is sort of one-sided and limited. Yeah. So the understanding involves thinking in fixed categories, and like Hegel's philosophy is not fixed in that way. It's sort of dynamic. And so in some sense, Hegel's committed to the view that his work can't be understood. Yeah. So if you read it and didn't understand it, that's probably a good thing. Yeah. If you did understand it, something's gone wrong. Yeah. If you think you understood it, you didn't. Yeah. So Hegel's quite hard. And so one thing is that I think with Hegel, I think it's really worthwhile just working through small bits of it. And so you get an idea of, you read what he has to say and it's like, this is just crazy, it doesn't mean anything. And then if there can be a few bits of it where you realize, okay, I get sort of what he's trying to say here, that's what I want to get out of Hegel. Yeah, right. You know, and I think looking at a very small bit of Hegel, the whole is sort of contained in the parts, and the parts contained in the wholes. Yeah. And so Hegel's one of those philosophers, wherever you start, you sort of end up with the whole system. That's one of the features of his philosophy. So wherever you start, if you dig down deep enough, you're going to get the whole somehow there as presupposed or involved implicitly in the in any part. So you can't understand any part until you've understood the whole thing. Yeah. So we're going to focus on this one little part at the beginning, but then it's going to turn out that the whole of the philosophy is in a sense contained within that part. So last class, we started looking at the introduction, and I said a bit about number one, and number, so let's make this observable. So I talked about it a bit, number one, with the idea of right, and it's tied to the idea of freedom. And then I said there's a digression. He talks about the methodology of philosophy in number three, and that what's central to his methodology is he's a sort of anti-foundationalist philosopher. Yeah, he's a sort of philosophy forms a circle, We don't, and it turns out that this anti-foundationalism is going to be central to his epistemology, but also to his philosophy of action. Yeah, and we'll see this when we have a look at what he says about the will. So we looked at number 2 and the idea that philosophy forms a circle. It's a bit of a digression. And number 3 is about positive right. And positive right has got to do with law as it exists. So in the natural law tradition, people like Aquinas made a distinction between positive law and natural law. Natural law is moral law. It's our abstract idea of justice. Positive law is the law as it exists within a society. Yeah, it's the actual law, the sort of stuff you would study at law school. And section 3, what we're going to find in section 3 is an attack on a certain form of historicism. So at the time that Hegel was writing, that there were a bunch of quite conservative people who wanted to defend the Prussian state, and they tended to form a form of unthinking conservative historicism. And this is the target of attack in section number 3. So section number 3 is about positive law, but it's also got an attack on conservatism. And I think he's trying to, Hegel wants a sort of middle line between unthinking conservatism and this sort of radical, destroy everything revolutionary approach. So he's trying to put a middle line between these two positions. So number 3, we're going to come back to. And then numbers 4, 5, 6, and 7, he introduces the idea of will, and then talks about what is it to have a will. And he looks at these 2 ways of thinking about the will that he calls one-sided. And one way you might think of is pure abstraction, too abstract. Another way is to think of yourself as in terms of what you've done, in terms of pure particularity. And these 2 ways of thinking of willing, he basically thinks are inadequate. And you need an account of the will that includes both elements. And I take it you might think that the kind of abstract way of thinking about willing is tied together with a form of political radicalism, whereas this way of thinking about willing in terms of identifying with what you are is tied to a form of conservatism, of unthinking conservatism. Yeah. These 2 aspects of the will that he wants to combine, in some sense embody or are appealed to by these different political traditions within his society. And I think, you know, maybe in any society, we have these 2 different poles. We have the kind of unthinking conservatives and the unrealistic radicals. Yeah, and Hegel wants to have an idea of willing that combines both of them. So this political distinction between conservatives and revolutionaries, he thinks is not a kind of just random historical distinction, but is rooted in what it is to be a human being, what it is to have a will, what it is to be an agent. Yeah. So it's going to turn out that these sort of political distinctions are rooted in something much more fundamental. Yeah. So that's what we're going to look at when we look at sections 4, 5, 6, and 7. And so 4 introduces the idea of will as free and talks about the relationship between theory and practice, between the intellect and practical reason. And then number 5 talks about this one-sidedness, the will as abstract. The second one, 6, talks about another one-sided way of thinking about the will as something determinate. And then number 7 offers his first account of how we can have a kind of unified, complete understanding of the self. Yeah, and he thinks that and this is what his whole philosophy is about. And he says that we have a sort of felt way of understanding this or grasping what it is to have an adequate will in terms of love and friendship. So love and friendship are going to offer a model of what it is to have a will. Is anyone else having problems with my voice? Is it breaking up at all? Just let me. Does anyone else have a problem?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let me try and put on the shade. Oops. Oh, so my phone is just now. Okay, it would take a. Okay, let me go to the connection hotspot. Okay. Let me see if this works. Hello, is that better?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I just came in with my phone. Okay, so basically, I was just telling you what we're going to talk about for the rest of the time on when we're talking about Hegel. We're going to look at his account of the will and his account of free will, and he looks at these two ways, two what he calls one-sided ways of thinking about the will, and he opposes to this a sort of adequate way of thinking about the will. The will is absolute. And this adequate way of thinking about the will is a way that, in some sense, includes both of these inadequate ways. Yeah, so it involves, in some sense, combining them in a certain way. The problem is that we can't really see intellectually how they can be combined. It looks like they're incompatible. It looks like they're inconsistent. And he suggests in number 7 that we can feel how these two ways of thinking about the will can be combined within the experience of love and friendship. Yeah, and ultimately he thinks that this way of combining these two elements is something that can only be done within the context of a modern state. Yeah, so we'll talk a bit about that. That's how the whole book fits together. So, okay, so now I'm back. Let me share the screen again. And I wanted to start off then by talking about number 3. And we started talking about this last time. And number 3 is where Hegel talks about positive law. So positive law is the law as it actually exists within a state. And I take it the form of the law, yeah, so there's going to be a form and a content. And I take it the form of a law just has to do with something like, you know, in most modern legal systems, what it is that makes something a law, there's a certain procedure it has to go through to be made a law. Yeah, so the form that something has to be a law in the modern world is it needs to be, voted upon by the parliament and then signed by the president and then published in the legal gazette. Yeah, and the general right. First of all, there's a formal side of it. What makes something a law in a society? You may think in a more kind of earlier society, I think Hegel would think more primitive society, what it may be for a law is just for there to be someone with the right type of authority. So we might think in an old princedom or kingdom, the form of law is just whatever the person in authority says you should do. Yeah, so we might think in kind of very primitive societies, you had something close to this, but the form of law just had to be the command of an appropriate authority. In terms of its content, he thinks that the law gets its content. So what the content of a law, what justifies, what grounds the content. And he thinks that the content is given, he says, by the particular national character of a people and its stage in historical development. Yeah, so you have a particular group of people who have a stage in terms of its historical development. And the kind of positive content of the law can be explained in terms of its history. And I take it there was a certain brand of conservative who Hegel was working against, who thinks that the laws of a particular society can be justified in purely historical terms. So one reason I think why Hegel is not a conservative. Yeah, so I talked to him in the first class when we talked about Hegel's politics. And I think one of the fundamental ways in which Hegel isn't a conservative is that he thinks that institutions, the norms and institutions of a society have to be justified. So there's a certain type of conservative who just says you should just follow whatever is the case. Yep, asking for justification can only undermine the order in society. Asking why, that's one question too many. So there's a certain type of conservative who wants to block any sort of questioning of tradition. And so Hegel clearly isn't that type of conservative. And if we're thinking of conservatives like that, you might think like people like Burke, who had reflections on revolution in France, and maybe sometimes Hume has views that seem a bit like this. Yeah, that questioning tradition can just lead to chaos. It's just going to undermine authority and lead to instability. So we should just kind of go along with whatever there is. And so Hegel is an anti-conservative in the sense that he thinks that the institutions of one's society need to be justified. So the question of justification is central for Hegel. This is the kind of Kantian side of Hegel. The question of justification is central. Yeah. Where he breaks with what he takes to be the Kantian side, the Rousseauian Kantian side, is we don't justify institutions by appealing to some ideal. We don't justify institutions by comparing what is with some timeless abstract ideal of justice. Yeah, because we have no access to that. Our thinking, our criteria, in some sense, have to be historically rooted as well. We can't get outside of history to find an ahistorical criteria of justification. But unlike the kind of unthinking conservatives, Hegel thinks that the laws of one's society, the laws and institutions of one's society are in need of justification. This is, as human beings, I mean, I think what's central for us as human beings is that we're self-interpreting animals, but we're sort of animals that can ask the question why. We're animals that don't just have a world, but the world is something for us. It means something for us. We ask about, we're able to question what's given to us, both phenomenally, both in terms of experience and in terms of norms. Yeah, we're able to reflect on these things and ask ourselves why. And so The unthinking conservative just doesn't ask why. They're kind of so sunken in tradition, they just take tradition as something given. And I think that sort of unthinking conservative, in some sense, I think Hegel thinks that human being can't really be like that. Yeah, animals maybe are like that, but for human beings, the question of justification is always there. Now, and just because a set of institutions exist doesn't mean they're justified. Yeah, so he says that force and tyranny may be an element in positive right. Now, positive right are the laws of a society as they exist, as they're kind of the public laws of a society. And you may have a dictatorship where someone seizes power and that person makes the law. Yeah, you can have a pre-modern type of kingdom. And I think Hegel thinks that sort of society, an aristocratic society, is also going to be a society based on force and tyranny. And the laws, in a certain sense, are not going to be justified. So I think the more intelligent type of conservative, and this was the school of historical criticism in Germany at the beginning of the 19th century, thought that you could justify the laws of your society by appealing to history. Yeah, so you had people like Karl von Savigny, Frederick Karl von Savigny, and he was the kind of leader of the historical school based in Berlin. And his sort of idea was that the laws of a society can be justified by showing their historical, how they've emerged historically. Yeah. So we can look at the laws of our society, and then to ask ourselves whether these laws are sort of justified, we can do this by appealing to their origin. So we have a sort of, okay, and so this type of conservative is not an unthinking conservative because they're still in the project of justification, but they think the laws within a society can be justified by appeals to history. And Hegel thinks there's something right about this. Yeah, that history does play a role. It's going to turn out for Hegel, history does play a role in justification, and so our justification of institutions is going to genealogy, origin, how these institutions came about is going to play a role, but mere history isn't going to be enough. Yeah, so in some sense, he's going to distinguish between mere history and what he calls philosophical history. And the philosophical history that Hegel wants to defend is a history that sees the emergence of certain institutions as the sort of expression, the actualization of something like a drive towards freedom. Yeah, so we do justify. So Hegel wants to justify the basic institutions of his society, the basic institutions of what he takes to be the modern world, by looking at how or why these institutions emerge, but not purely historically, not just, yeah, but looking at how history itself and how the emergence of institutions is sort of driven by a sort of drive to actualize freedom. Yeah, Atesh.
So in that sense, is improvements a given factor in historical development, or does he see that there may be parts that the society may decline?
Okay, yeah. So other times when I've taught Hegel, the other kind of bit of Hegel that I think works as an undergraduate class are the introductions to his lectures on the philosophy of history. So if you're interested in what Hegel has to say about history in general, then you've got these lectures, which are lectures on the philosophy of history. The introduction to their lectures gives an overview of his ideas about history. And I think actually those lectures are more readable. I think it's more, in some sense, it's easier than the introduction to the philosophy of right. Yeah, So if you're interested, have a look there. Now, the problem is that there's big disagreements about how to interpret Hegel. Yeah. So he does offer a progressive view of history. Yeah. So if we look at history, we can see this movement from, say, the ancient world, and he's thinking of the ancient Greek world, to the modern world. And modernity, in some sense, is better than, you know, that this movement from the ancient world to the aristocratic kind of Middle Ages to modernity is a story in which there's progress. And we can see the emergence of a certain type of freedom, a certain type of society that makes sort of human freedom possible. Now, so he's got this broad brush history of emergence. Now, does this mean that he's a sort of historical determinist who thinks that it's sort of inevitable, who thinks that, you know, that there's this sort of path that history cannot avoid? And I think no. So I think the point of view is that so one thing is that he wants to offer a justification, and he wants to help us feel at home in the modern world. And so in some sense, the story he's telling is an idealized story that we can use for our own self-understanding. So we take the present state we're in as a sort of given, and we tell a story about the past that we can use to make sense of our present. Yeah. And so I think part of it, like, the end of history is always now. Yeah. So when he talks about the end of history, is this kind of from some viewpoint outside of the present, some absolute perspective? Or when he talks about the end of history, is it always the end of history? And I think for Hegel, it's always the end of history. Yeah, insofar as we're, or it's, you know, that we always look at history from the present, and we have to understand how we got to where we are. I do think, though, that Hegel thinks that there are, you know, you might think there are going to be certain evolutionary forces at work in the development of society. Yeah, so you might think that kind of despotism. So I think Hegel, for example, thinks that despotism is sort of unstable. Yeah, so societies that aren't based on freedom have various sorts of instabilities within them. Yeah. Now, I mean, if you're interested in Hegel's worked out views, have a look at the lectures on the history of philosophy. But I think, for example, some societies can get stuck, I think Hegel thinks, in certain repressive forms that can sort of self-perpetuate for some time. I think Hegel thinks that there's going to be sort of certain types of evolutionary pressures that are going to push societies towards increasing freedom. Yeah. So there is going to be some sort of teleology within history, but the goal, it's not like the goal is a sort of plan there already, but the sort of institutions that get created are going to be the expressions of human will and human striving. And human beings are embodied creatures with certain types of needs, you know, with certain, and these needs, some of them are physical and some of them are going to be, you know, more spiritual. That human beings have needs to, you know, they have needs of food, of shelter. So societies are going to develop, human societies are going to develop some sort of forms of shelter, things like housing, things like huts. Yeah, these are going to be things that and I take it he thinks that human beings have this need to understand their place in the world and have a need to feel at home in the world. Yeah, because we're these questioning animals. And so it's going to turn out that certain forms of political organization are not going to be things that people as a whole can identify with. And if people can't identify with the institutions in their society, this is going to mean that there's going to be pressure on them to change them. Yeah. So Hegel thinks there's a kind of, in human history, that there is going to be certain pressures that drive historical evolution and the evolution of institutions, and that that this is going to mean that certain types of institutions are going to be unstable. They're going to contain contradictions within themselves, and I think part of it is because we're the sort of creatures that kind of for whom justification is important. Yeah, that one of the big questions are, to what degree are these institutions that people can live in? That to what degree are these institutions that people can feel at home in? Yeah, and it turns out that many of the institutions in pre-modern world are the sort of institutions where people can't feel at home in them. Yeah, he talks about the master-slave dialectic. Yeah, in the phenomenology. I don't know if you've read the phenomenology of spirit, but he thinks that kind of servitude, these sort of hierarchical structures, are such that neither the master nor the slave can really feel at home in. And so there's going to be a sort of pressure towards institutions that involve some basic type, some sort of equality. So I think you might think that there's going to be a push towards certain types of equality within institutions, because if you have massive domination, these sort of institutions are going to be unstable for various reasons. Does that help? So I don't think he thinks it's inevitable. So once again, remember that you've got something like a base and superstructure distinction in Hegel. So what's actual and what's rational is something like the basic structure. You've got, yeah, and so we might see sort of, if we look at history, we may see sort of broad brush historical trends. And in some sense, he's optimistic about the broad brush historical trends, because there's going to be pressures that are going to undermine in the long term things like dictatorships and societies where social relations are based purely on force. But in the short term, you get all sorts of chaos. Yeah, so the rationality is sort of below the surface. Yeah, the messy day-to-day thrust of politics and history, that can be messy. But there's going to be a sort of philosophical history. So Hegel's the sort of inventor of what we might think of as philosophical history. That's what his lectures on the philosophy of history are, where we understand the kind of underlying trends of historical development. Yeah. I think, after Hegel, of course, you get Marx, who also wants to tell a story of the sort of trends that underlie historical development, but more in terms of economic relations. Hegel himself thinks that economic relations are really central to these sort of things. So he doesn't ignore them, but he doesn't give them the centrality Marx does. But I think in the 20th century, you had this historian Butterfield, who had this book called The Whig Theory of History. So the Whig was the English liberal. And the Whig theory of history is that there's this sort of historical trajectory towards freedom. Yeah. And I think Hegel is sort of one of the originators of this Whig theory, Whig account of history, that there's a sort of trajectory towards freedom and equality within history there, because there are underlying sort of, you might think of something like underlying evolutionary forces in the social sphere that are going to, yeah. And I think that, still today, there's a disagreement between historians, between intellectuals, about the degree to which we should think of history in these vaguely teleological terms. I think today, of course, we don't appeal to teleology with God, but we can think that evolution can, if we look at evolution of organisms, we might think there's a tendency towards certain types of optimality. Yeah, and so I think this is the sort of Hegelian view. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, but there's a lot of disagreements. So with regard to history, he appeals to Montesquieu. Yeah, so he says Montesquieu stated the true historical view. Yeah, the genuinely philosophical viewpoint. Oh, so Montesquieu is a good guy. The legislation in general and its particular determinations should not be considered in isolation and in the abstract, but rather as a dependent moment within one totality. So if we want to understand in the context of all the other determinations which constitute the character of a nation and age, within this context, they gain their genuine significance and then also their justification. So the sort of understanding the meaning of laws and to justify these laws does involve placing these laws within their historical context. Yeah. So we shouldn't have this sort of Rousseauian idea that we compare the actual laws with some idea that we've just pulled out of our head. Yeah. So understanding the historical context and emergence of laws and norms in one society is going to play a central role in their justification. Yeah. They shouldn't be. This is part of his anti-foundationalism. Justification is always contextual. Yeah, we should consider laws and norms in a society as a moment within one totality. We should understand how these norms, how these laws and norms and institutions of the society we live in fit together with other norms and institutions. We look at why they emerged historically, and this is going to play a central role in their justification. But to consider the emergence and development of determinate nations of right as they appear in time is a purely historical task. So, I mean, yeah, so he's going to reject this purely historical account of justification. Yeah, and this is the view that is tied with, yeah, and that purely understanding the historical emergence of certain institutions, certain laws, certain norms, has the same sort of status as recognizing the logical consistency of something. So logical consistency is important. Yeah, to show that something's logically consistent is important. But logical consistency doesn't entail truth. Something can be logically consistent and false. Yeah, so consistency is compatible with falsity, just as something can be historically necessary in some sense, but wrong. So something can be historic. We can understand the historical emergence of something. It can be in some sense historically necessary, but it can be unjust and wrong. Yeah, so showing why something was necessary historically in and of itself doesn't show that it's just. Yeah, so my sort of reading here is that logical consistency is going to be something like a negative criterion of truth. You don't want inconsistency. You want your institutions to be consistent in some way. If they're no, it's going to turn out we don't always want that. He says, if you live in an unjust world, sometimes inconsistency is the best way of going about things. So if the laws are unjust, inconsistent judgments might be the best thing to do. This is something he talks about at the end of this section. Yeah, and this sort of historical task, understanding laws historically, is meritorious and praiseworthy within its own sphere. Savigny, I'm doing philosophy, you're doing history. Keep away. What you're doing isn't justification. Yeah, but it bears no relation to the philosophical approach. Yeah, unless that is to say, development from historical grounds, so this is the kind of purely historicist view, is confused with development from the concept. Yeah, and the significance of historical explanation and justification is extended to include a justification which is valid in and for itself. Now, I think this is Hegel's way of saying, okay, it's confused with development from the concept. So development from the concept, when he talks about development from the concept, we have this distinction between something in itself and something being in for itself. And I take it the sort of idea is that development from the concept involves some sort of potentiality being actualized. So development of the concept involves the actualization of a potentiality. Yep. And I take it that what's and so a truly historical justification is one that understands the institutions of the society one lives in as the actualization of some potentiality. It's the actual, and what's it going to be the actualization of? Well, the actualization of will, the actualization of self-determination. So will is self-determination, and will is only really fully actualized in a society where you have freedom, because freedom is self-determination. Yep. So if we can understand the institutions we live in as the actualization, as a sort of drive towards freedom, and that sort of explanation is going to be historical, because this, we have a process of actualization, something going from potential to actual. So there's going to be a historical element to it, but it's not purely historicist, because it appeals to this notion of freedom. But this is not to compare reality to some abstract ideal. Yeah, so because it, in some sense, explaining something is the actualization of human potential. Yep, and we can, it's not like we have start off with a sort of plan or an ideal. Yeah, Atesh.
So is it such that freedom requires the actualization of the possibility? Okay, I think I lost my point here. So is there a circularity that he talks about in the, I mean, freedom points to the actualization of the concept, but it also requires an actualization itself.
So I think Hegel is fundamentally a sort of Aristotelian. You might think that a human being's a rational animal, yeah, but actually kind of living well involves actualizing our potential. So a child is a human being in itself, but it hasn't actualized its humanity. And so actualizing one's humanity involves actualizing this potential. And this is something that is done, this is something that requires maturation, but it also requires education. And it requires education into the right type of community. Yeah, so to kind of, in some sense, actualize yourself as a rational animal can only be done in a sort of community which provides the right type of education and the right type of structure. So we might think that we can understand justification in terms of something like you can look at how a certain type of way you are as an adult is the realization of human potential, and that you've gone through the right type of education, the right type of what Hegel calls Bildung. Yeah, you've acquired what Aristotle and Hegel call second nature. So our first nature is this purely animal nature. Second nature is this sort of encultured nature. Now, that of course things can go wrong. So some human beings can get diseased, like you can be hit by a car. Your society, could be hit by a comet. There could be wars, natural disasters. that undermine the sort of things going on in society. But yeah, I take it that this actualization, think about the kind of a human being growing up into an adult in a well-functioning society. And then we might think of cultural evolution in these terms. So we might think of cultural evolution as sort of maturation, but also you might think of as there's this guy Wrangham who has this idea that human cultural evolution is a kind of is a process of self-domestication. Yeah, but you might think that Hegel's got this idea that societies, cultures can mature. They mature by learning from their mistakes. So you might look at a child, a teenager, and a teenager might go a bit crazy and be all rebellious, and at the time you might think, oh, they're all messed up. Yeah, but then you look back and you can think of stage in their development towards an adult. They had to go through this stage in order to kind of reach adulthood. In the Amish community, people know about the Amish. So the Amish are a community in America. They were kind of radical Protestant sects who moved to North America in the 17th century, and they live in the same way. They try and live in the sort of 17th century way. So they don't have cars. They think buttons are evil. So buttons are just a form of showing off. And if you're a woman and you have buttons, that's like wearing a miniskirt. You're just trying to flaunt your kind of, it's all showing off. And so they have these very strict moral codes. But at the age of, I think, 18, all of the children are sent off in the world. And they're supposed to go off in the world and experience the non-kind of religious life and go crazy. And then most of them end up coming back. And the idea is this wild year or wild years, they can't really freely choose the adult life of an Amish unless they've seen the alternative. Yep. And so they go out and get messed up and do crazy stuff. Yeah. And you might think, well, that we can tell a similar story in societal development. There may be stages in development that are sort of necessary when we look back, that are for reaching maturity, but in themselves are not things that are justified. I think that's if you're interested in the Amish, one of my friends made a documentary about them from college. It was nominated for an Oscar a few years ago. It's called Devil's Playground. Yeah, and it's basically a documentary about these kids. And it's sort of quite interesting. If you're interested in things about faith. Yeah, this is the sort of attack on Sauvigny going on here. So what we're finding in these paragraphs is the attacks on the historicist school of justification of law. Yeah, he says determinations of right. So particular kind of determinations is always sort of a bit limited and one-sided, I think, for Hegel. So the sort of particular laws we have in a society may be shown to be entirely grounded in and consistent with the prevailing circumstances and existing legal institutions. Yep. Yet it may be contrary to right and irrational in and for itself. Yep. And so he says, for example, like numerous determinations of Roman civil law, which followed quite consistently from such institutions as Roman paternal authority and the Roman family. So you had this hierarchy, you had this non-free patriarchal Roman family, and the legal system in Rome was sort of based on this. It was sort of consistent, it followed from it. And Hegel looks at this and says, but this is not right. This is wrong. Yeah. Now, I think he can say that from his perspective in history. So he doesn't want to stand outside of history and say this, but from within his perspective in history, he can look back at this stage of history and say, this is wrong. Just as, my wild teenage years, I was a bit of a monster. I messed up in all sorts of ways. I needed to do it because I needed to find out who I was. But maybe some of the things I did were wrong. Looking back as an adult, things I did when I was a teenager, I can endorse as stages within my history, but I can look back and say, I wouldn't do that now. That's the sort of attitude. Yeah. So this attack on historicism is, so once again, I'm going to say one more thing and then we can have a break. Now, he talks about the historical school at the top of page 30, and then compares this to compares a true justification our electricity is just gone. Why don't we have a 10-minute break? Why don't we have a 15-minute break? Because I'm talking from my, can anyone hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, yes. So all the electricity in our apartment is gone. Why don't we start again at 2:10, and maybe by then the electricity will come back. Otherwise, I can try and use my laptop. Let me, hopefully that will work, but it will take a little bit of time to set up. Hopefully, sometimes it just goes, but sometimes the electricity goes and then we don't have it for like a day or two. Yeah. Okay, so let's say we'll meet again in 15 minutes. What's that? Hi guys, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so I'm now on my laptop that isn't fully charged, but I think I've got enough for this class. Oh, the joys of living in Turkey, in Istanbul. It's like, so I'm sorry about that. It's going to be a bit difficult. Oh, hold on. How do I'm just. So I normally use a different version of Adobe. I'm just trying to work out how to have the, oh, hold on. I don't want the hand, oh yeah, hold on. Yeah, that's better. Okay, so, oh no. So let me put on my different glasses instead of the wrong distance. Yeah, so sorry about that. Shall I get started again? So okay, hold on. So on page 230, on page 30, he makes a distinction between a true justification, and a justification by circumstances. And once again, he has this comparison between historical justification and the law of non-contradiction. So in a logical deduction, in a logical proof, you can show logical consistency. You can show the premises follow from the conclusion, but showing that the premises follow from the conclusion to show that the conclusion follows from the premises doesn't show anything about justification unless the premises are true. So a justification by circumstances has a kind of an analogous situation to a logical proof. So a logical proof just shows that the conclusion follows from the premises, but it doesn't tell you anything about the status of the premises. So a logical deduction from the premises, which may themselves be as valueless as the conclusions derived from them. So in terms of his purely historicative justification, the relative is put in place of the absolute. So the historicist offers a merely relative justification, whereas what philosophy demands is an absolute justification. And an absolute justification is not one that is context dependent, doesn't depend upon the local circumstances. So that what Hegel wants to offer is going to be something like an absolute justification. And he thinks that this can be done through an appeal to the concept of freedom and the concept of will. Now, of course, you may have heard Hegel and Hegel's talk about the absolute. And so this is, for Hegel, when you hear about the absolute, it's always something good. The absolute is the good guy. The absolute is the kind of what is what we want. And the absolute for Hegel normally involves kind of combining things that appear contradictory. So when we start talking about the will, we're going to look at these two accounts of the will that are one-sided. And then we might think there's a conception of the will and a conception of freedom that is an absolute conception of freedom. It's not a dependent, it's not a relative conception. Yeah. So he's attacking the mere historicist for, in some sense, offering merely a relative form of justification. And he thinks that what we want for. Yeah. So for the historicist, the relative is put in place of the absolute, and the external appearance in place of the nature of the thing itself. Yeah. When a historical justification confuses an origin in external factors with an origin in the concept, so a sort of non-philosophical type of historicism is going to not offer the right type of justification. It unconsciously achieves the opposite of what it attends. So a purely historical justification, there's a sort of paradox, because in some sense, if you say something's justified because of what happened in the past, because of how it emerged, then if the circumstances have changed, then what was once justified is no longer justified. Yeah, so if it can be shown that the origin of an institution was entirely expedient and necessary under the specific circumstances of the time, so this is what a historicist may offer, that something's necessary because it was needed at the time, the requirements of the historical viewpoint are fulfilled. But if this is supposed to amount to a general justification of the thing itself, the result is precisely the opposite. For since the original circumstances are no longer present, the institution has therefore lost its meaning and its right to exist. So if all we look at if all we do is look to the past as well, then this form of justification is in some sense never going to be adequate. Because if something's justified because it emerged because of something going on in the past that no longer exists, then in some sense it's sort of lost its justification if the circumstances have changed. So what Hegel wants to offer is a philosophical view of the same origins, and a sort of philosophical account of the origins of institutions can't just start with history. He says some more stuff. I think Hegel is sometimes taken to be a sort of crude historicist. So I think it's worthwhile just looking at a couple of other passages. I'm just going to highlight them so you can mark them down. There's a lot of stuff here and it's quite difficult to read, and he's talking about Roman history. I think sometimes it's just important to point out the bits that are kind of quite significant. Yeah, so one thing is that, he makes it quite clear that Roman family law, slavery, etc., did not satisfy even the most modest demands of reason. Yeah, so the Roman patriarchal family and slavery, in some sense, don't even satisfy the most modest demands of reason. So Hegel doesn't have a problem calling certain institutions in other societies unjust. Yeah. I mean, what he's against is the idea that we can stand outside time and do this. Yeah, our capacity to evaluate our criteria are always within history, but they're not fully determined by the history. Yeah, this is the idea. One thing that I like, and I think is worth pointing out for people into logic, is that logical consistency. Hegel's got an interesting view about it. He believes that logical consistency is what the understanding does. The understanding cares about logical consistency. But he thinks that reason, in some sense, goes beyond logical consistency. So logical consistency is inadequate. Yeah, it's insufficient to arrive at truth because something can be consistent but false. Yeah, so logical consistency can't itself be a criterion of truth. But secondly, that reason sometimes demands inconsistency. So he says, sometimes the very inconsistency of the Roman jurists should be regarded as one of their greatest virtues. So one of the greatest virtues of Roman legal scholars was their inconsistency. Why might you think, how could inconsistency be a virtue?
If the laws themselves are not justified.
Yeah. So you have these laws that, you know, the laws themselves may be inconsistent with our practices. Yeah, so we find these inconsistencies within our communities, within our societies. So one example he does is the fiction that a daughter was a son. So in Roman law, only sons could inherit. But in order to keep the big families alive, which was an important part of stability, that sometimes a family only had daughters. And so if a family only had daughters, the jurist decided, well, the oldest daughter would then count as a son. Yeah. And this was a way of kind of achieving, in some sense, the goals of the legal system. Yeah. So I take it like legal systems, you have the law, and then you have the sort of the grounds of the law, the sort of ideal behind the law, why the law is there. And I think in all legal systems, these sort of come apart. When a legal system reaches maturity, there develops a sort of split between the content of the law and the ideals behind it. And then in some sense, to achieve to get the greatest consistently, sometimes inconsistent judgment is the way to go forward. Yeah. And this is something that's been taken up by one of my favorite logicians. Does anyone here like logic? So if you like logic, do you know about Graham Priest? Yeah, so Graham Priest, he kind of he's got a book called Beyond the Limits of Thought, and he has a discussion of Hegel at the beginning of that book. So if you like logic, and Graham defends a form of, well, you have paraconsistent logics. So paraconsistent logics in classical logic, everything follows from a contradiction. So it's an axiom of classical logic that P and not P entails Q. So if you find a contradiction, anything follows from it. Now, of course, and this is known as the principle of explosion, the principle that anything follows from a contradiction. So we write that P and not P entails Q. If P and not P, therefore Q. It means you can basically infer anything from a contradiction. But of course, this shows that classical logic is not going to be very good for modeling beliefs or modeling databases. Because databases, you very often, and in beliefs, in a database, you very often get contradictions. You get contradictory bits of information. And you don't want a database to conclude everything based on the fact that there's some inconsistent information there. Similarly, with our belief systems, I'm pretty sure that at least some of my beliefs are contradictory. I don't know which ones, but I'm pretty sure my belief set is inconsistent somewhere and somehow. I think we all should believe that. There are some inconsistent, but if classical logic is right, the fact that there's some inconsistency in my belief set entails that it's rational to believe everything. Yeah, because if there's one inconsistency, everything follows from it. So classical logic doesn't offer a very good way of thinking about rationality and beliefs. Yeah, because if you've got a set of you want some logic that's able to deal with what do you do when you know that some of your beliefs are inconsistent. You don't want to be told, oh, anything follows from that. Yeah, and so Graham Priest, they have these paraconsistent logics called relevance logics that think that not everything follows from a contradiction. And then Graham Priest has developed these dialethic logics where P and not P can be true. And if you're interested, he's quite fun. We had him in Istanbul a few years ago. A friend of mine organized a conference on Indian logic at Istanbul University. And then we had a workshop on paraconsistent logics with him and Stephen Reed. He's an interesting guy. So if you like logic and you're sort of you know, Hegel curious, I think Graham Priest's a fun person to look at. So Beyond the Limits of Thought is one, but he's got a lot of fun books, and I think he's good. And I think this is kind of grist for the paraconsistent mill. I think you can see where Hegel, so you know, if your normative system is inconsistent, then inconsistent particular judgments can sometimes be a virtue. Yeah, being fully consistent in an unjust system is worse than being inconsistent. Yeah, so inconsistency in judgment can be a good thing. Yeah, if one's principles themselves are inconsistent. Yeah, if there's a tension between the principles and some other norms. And this is anyway. So logical consistency isn't enough. What we need, and historical justification isn't enough. What we need is this. What we need is this derivation from the concept. We need this absolute justification. We need a philosophical view of history. And we need a philosophical view of the history of Geist. We need a philosophical view of the emergence of normativity and of institutions. And only such an account can offer, real justification. I think that's the view. So let's start again. Let's start again in number 4. Let's start from let's kind of start again philosophically. I think this is how it sort of works. We get an introduction in 1, we get a bit of fuddling around in 2 and 3, and then number 4, let's start again. Yeah, so the basis of right is the realm of spirit. Yeah, so Geist is the realm of Geist. And of course, remember, Geist is mind, but it's more like, you know, it's the human activity. Yeah, it's the realm of, yeah, and so right, we can think of the normative sphere, has its ground, Boden, its basis in human rational activity. Yeah, and in general, and its precise location and point of departure is the will. So the sort of laws, the norms, the institutions of our societies arise as the result of human rational agency, of human will. And the will is free. Hold on. What's this? So that freedom constitutes its substance and destiny. Freedom constitutes its substance and its Bestimmung. I mean, can be vocation. This is how it's often translated with Fichte. Bestimmung can mean determination in one sense. But it's freedom is the essence and the goal of the will. This destiny, this Bestimmung, is maybe vocation, calling. That will is potentially free, and true will is actualized freedom. Yeah. So, and the system of right is the realm of actualized freedom. Yeah. So we've got the idea that what Geist is, in some sense, what human beings are free beings, rational beings, but we are these beings potentially, and that this nature, this substance has to be actualized. Yeah. So the system of right the norms and institutions of our society are the realm of actualized freedom. Their freedom not as something hidden behind in the, but their freedom reified. So I don't know, once again, if you've read any Marx, we have this notion of reification. But I take it that this is a very Hegelian idea, that human activity is reified, that the institutions of our society are products of human will. They're human will made objective. They're the objectification of human subjectivity. They're freedom made concrete. Yeah, that the basis of right is the realm of spirit. The will is free, and the basis of right is the world of spirit produced from within itself as a second nature. Yeah, so once again, we have this idea of nature and second nature. The normative, so and this fits into his broader philosophy, and once again, it's very Aristotelian, but we can make a distinction between nature and second nature. The normative sphere is somehow second nature. Yeah, we're animals, we live in this world, but we don't just live in a physical world, we live in a social world. And the social world is a sort of second nature that has come into existence through human rational activity. Yeah, so we live in a world in which, as individuals, we come into this world and we find all of these pre-existing social institutions. Yeah, and these social institutions include things like the law, but they also include things like language. So language is second nature. Language, I think, is actualized freedom. So language is an institution that has come into existence through human rational activity, through the exercise of human nature. And the language we find ourselves born into is also part of the world of spirit that has been produced from within itself as a second nature. Yeah. So the philosophy of right, we've got the philosophy of nature and the philosophy of right. Yeah, these are the two major divisions of Hegel's encyclopedia. The philosophy of Geist, the philosophy of mind, of which philosophy of Geist is a part. But the philosophy of nature deals with first nature. Philosophy of right deals with second nature. It's not supernatural, but it's stuff that's been, we've got a whole bunch of stuff in the social world that is basically reified human activity. The whole normative sphere, I'd say, is going to be part of this. Yeah, the Hegel gives us, lots of people coming from a Hegelian, Kantian Hegelian background make a distinction between, saying, the natural and the normative. Yeah, and that we can think of of right, the system of right, as basically the sort of normative sphere. And I think this, and the idea is that ultimately the normative sphere is justified insofar as we can reflexively feel at home within it. Yeah, so is the system of right such that we can reflexively feel at home within it? Yeah, and of course, the opposite of feeling at home is going to be alienation. Yeah, so is the modern, to justify the modern world is in some sense to overcome alienation, to show that we can live at home in the world. Now, Atesh?
I wonder how Hegel escapes moral relativism in the sense that the rights, the domain of the rights is the subject, as far as I understand.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
How see?
So I think, yeah, so it's the absolute, isn't it? So the absolute is the non-relative. So you want something absolute that isn't relative, and you want your justification to be this. So you've got these two types of what he takes to be relativism. So I think he thinks both the conservatives and the radicals are sort of relativists in a certain way. So the kind of conservative historicists just appeal to the history, and that's sort of relativist. But the kind of moralists, the radicals, appeal to their conscience. And once again, as I mentioned, he thinks that appeals to conscience are too subjective. That in some sense, that the way you solve this is to have an account that gives you both. But then you might think, well, just adding two relative things together, does that really give you something absolute? Haven't you just got a kind of a more subtle relativism? That, I mean, this justification isn't meant to be timeless. So one thing is that the kind of Hegel's addressing himself to the people of his age. Yeah, so we're looking at this from the outside. And so a justification is something that's supposed to allow one to be reconciled to the particular world one lives in. Yeah, so yeah. So yeah, so there's a sort of one sort of reading of Hegel that's sort of existentialist, that we've got a choice whether to kind of reconcile ourselves to the world we live in. And in order to do that, we've got to be able to tell this historicist story. We've got to be able to tell this, that we might just choose to rebel, you know, so in some sense, given our natures, rebellion and refusal to be reconciled and saying no is always a real possibility. And I think that, I mean, part of me thinks that Hegel doesn't think that we can rule that out argumentatively. So, but I mean, so yeah, so yeah, so this idea of sort of reflexively feeling at home in the world, or reflect, I mean, I say feeling, I think feeling maybe makes it too subjective. Yeah, so there's got to be a cognitive side to it. So, yeah, so, I mean, that's a good question. I mean, how can Hegel avoid relativism? So the answer Hegel gives is, oh, the absolute. So my system is absolute in some sense. And so that's, yep. And then the question becomes, yeah, so Hegel, I'm not really sure how this absolute is supposed to work. Yeah. And it seems to me that his sort of, I mean, his position seems to be less relativist than the alternatives. Yeah, so you might think that relativism kind of comes in degrees, and we might think that we can have a sort of justification involves a kind of, ideally, justification involves something non-relativist, so that we should, in some sense, yeah, so one thing is that, you know, last time we talked about foundationalism. So he's a non-foundationalist. So one way of kind of avoiding relativism is just to say, oh, you've got some kind of absolute foundation, you know, God, subjectivity, whatever you want it to be. And Hegel wants to reject that. So, and he doesn't want to be a relativist. So the question is it possible to be a non-foundationalist without being a relativist? And I'm not sure. My sort of answer to that would be, if it is possible, then Hegel's the guy to look at and see how you might do it. Yeah, but it's not obvious. Yeah, so Atesh, I mean, how do you avoid relativism? Because in some sense, each one of us, so Hegel, like each one of us is a child of our time. And so the justification we give and we can't step outside of our time. So when we look back at Hegel, we can recognize Hegel's limitations. So I think, we look at Hegel today and, we can look at things and we think, well, he was right to be against slavery. He was right to be against the patriarchal family. And we can see from our perspective, But for example, his account of the family, I think that we might have problems with. That he thinks that you have these families, and families plays a very important role in ethical life. It's going to be a central role. So I think we might think that might be right. But then he thinks that only the head of the household should really be involved in civil society. So you have the father, in some sense, is the representative of the family in the world, and you've got quite a kind of traditional division of labor within the family. And I think today we'll look at Hegel's understanding of the family and think that, hold on, we can go beyond that. So it's going to turn out that from Hegel's perspective, if we're Hegelians, if we kind of take the spirit of Hegel, we look back on Hegel and we look at Hegel's justification as sort of limited and one-sided, and and I think Hegel wouldn't have a problem with that. So I think that the one part of the Hegelian kind of picture is that within our own societies, there are always going to be things that are contradictory, that are imperfect, and we're not exactly sure. We only find out ways to deal with these imperfections concretely. So we might be able to recognize certain problems, suggest certain types of answers, but our capacity to think of answers abstractly is never going to live up to the capacity of reality to solve problems concretely. So problems are solved through the emergence of kind of concrete institutions that can overcome some of these problems. And I think if you're a Hegelian, you might think, our position is going to be limited. There are certain things where maybe we can see problems, but not be able to fully understand the solution. So I guess that's one way one can go as a sort of Hegelian, to kind of, in some sense, admit the limitations of one's own position as a being within history, to recognize one's fallibility. And I think that's, to recognize that maybe justification is always going to be subject to further questions and clarifications. So Hegel's, as an anti-foundationalist, Hegel's sort of against the unjustified justifier. So you've got the unmoved mover, which is a sort of, in some sense, an ontological foundation. You don't want that. But you also have the sort of unjustified justifier. And the unjustified justifier is a sort of an epistemic foundation. And Hegel's against any sort of unjustified justifier. So anything can be called into question. I guess one thing that Hegel thinks, though, is that you can't call everything into question at the same time. That's the road of absolute abstraction. So the question is can Hegel does Hegel's philosophy collapse into relativism? He thinks not. So I think he's going to give us various ways of, as we're reading through, why don't we see what we think of it. So let's talk about number 4 a bit more. I just want to run through this. So it's not like you've got wills and then you've got free wills. The will is free by its nature. what it is to be a will is to be free. And freedom is just as much a basic determination of the will as the weight is a basic determination of bodies. Yeah. Will without freedom is an empty world, is an empty word. Yeah. And freedom is only actual as will or as subject. So free, I mean, he's not saying everything we do is free, but basically what it's going to turn out that this is the Kantian side of Hegel, that will without freedom is an empty word. What a will is autonomous. Yeah, that will is autonomy, will is self-determination. Yeah, so to willing is a sort of actualization of self-determination. And he thinks that animals don't really have wills. Yeah, they behave in certain ways, but I think will is something essentially human. So willing, I mean, in Aristotelian terms, we might think, yeah, willing is rational activity. Yeah, we might go Aristotelian, but he wants to kind of Kantianize Aristotle. So willing is rational activity, and rational activity is self-determination. Yeah, so Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics, he thought that the goal of all activity is contemplation, theoria. The highest form of activity is thought thinking itself. And Hegel, I think, has a practical Aristotelianism. No, what's really the highest isn't thought thinking itself, but willing itself. Yeah. So in terms of the kind of telos of Geist, of humanity, the telos is to actualize the will. We might think, hold on, you got Schopenhauer. You've got Nietzsche's will to power. I think both Schopenhauer and Nietzsche hated Hegel, but they're far more influenced by Hegel than one might think. So will without freedom is an empty world. Now, he has an interesting discussion about the relationship between willing and thought, between the theoretical and the practical. And once again, I mentioned how Hegel rejects. So for Kant, we have two basic faculties. And for Aristotle, we have practical reason and theoretical reason. We have thinking and acting. We have theory and practice. And Hegel wants to reject, and it's really central to Hegel's whole philosophy, to reject the distinction between the practical and the theoretical, between theoretical reason and practical reason, between thinking and acting. You know, thinking is just a particular type of activity. Yep, and action is just a particular way of thinking. Physical action is just one way of thinking. It's to think with one's body. The thinking is just an action. It's a particular type of action. So we don't want this radical separation between the theoretical and the practical. Yeah. So he says, spirit is thought in general. I would say thought in general, we might just think of, once again, in Aristotelian terms, we might think, well, thought in general is rational activity. So spirit we may think of as sort of rational activity, human activity. Spirit is thought in general, and the human being is distinguished from the animal by thought. Yeah, so once again, very Aristotelian. Thought is the essence of the human, it's what makes us human. Therefore, the good human life is a life, you know, a good human life is a fully human life. It's a life for Aristotle, of rational activity. And I think Hegel sort of buys into this. The human being is distinguished from the animal by thought, but it must not be imagined that a human being thinks on the one hand and wills on the other, that he has thought in one pocket and volition in another.
for this would be an empty representation. So this is a kind of abstractly, we can make an abstract distinction between thought and action, between will and intellect. Yeah, but this is just an abstraction. Yeah, in reality, that the distinction between thought and will is simply that between theoretical and practical attitude. They are not two separate faculties. Once again, this is a really radical claim. I think was really taken up by the sort of pragmatists, and is, I think many people now believe this, but it's a very kind of the action and the intellect, theoretical reason, no, we don't have these two separate faculties. Yep, the will is a particular way of thinking. So acting is just a way of thinking. What is it? It's thinking. So what the will is thinking, translating it into existence. Yep, so will is thought. So will is, in some sense, the subjective becoming objective. And abstract thought is basically the objective becoming subjective. But the will is a particular way of thinking translating itself into existing. Thinking is the drive to give itself existence. So the will is this drive to make the world comprehensible, to make the world rational, to make the world intelligible. Yep. How can we understand the world around us? Because we've sort of made it. And that's going to be particularly true with the social world. The social world is intelligible, is understandable, is justified because it's an expression of human rational activity. So we find ourselves in the social world. And that's how we justify a particular form of social life, because we find ourselves in the world. Yep. But there are forms of social life where you have sort of oppression, I take it, where we can't find ourselves in the world. This is a sort of my left Hegelian spin on all of this. Yeah. The distinction between thought and will can be expressed as follows. So here's thought. He tells us first of all about thought. When I think of an object, I make it into a thought and deprive it of its sensuous qualities. I make it into something which is essentially and immediately mine. So thought, in today's terminology, not Hegel's, we may say thinking involves conceptually representing the world. And there's a difference between the object and the concept of the object, between the object and my subjective representation of an object. Yeah. So when I think of something, I grasp the world conceptually with thought, but in so doing, I abstract from the concrete reality. And I make the object into something that is essentially and immediately mine. Yeah, we have the thing and then we have the name. The name we may think of as something subjective that fits into a system of thought. It's immediately and essentially mine. Yeah. And yep, for it is only when I think that I am with myself. So it's only when I think when I'm at home with myself. And it is only by comprehending it that I can penetrate an object. So I penetrate an object by comprehending it. It's very sexual, you know, like thought as sex. Yep. I have sex with the world. But it turns out that I think Hegel thinks that taking the world and making it yours by abstracting ultimately in itself doesn't work. The only way we can comprehend the world ultimately is by making the world rational. So we come to comprehend the nature, second nature, by in some sense creating a rational social world around us. And it's through, so real penetration of the world isn't a matter of abstract contemplation, of taking the world and making it mine in thought. It's not a matter of conceptualizing, but it's going to be a matter of action. Yeah, kind of, yeah, that ultimately the best way of coming to comprehend the world is to make the world thought. And we make the world thought through action, through the reification of the thought in the world. And that's what the second nature is. That's what the normative sphere is. It's Geist, rational activity that has been reified. It is only by comprehending it that I can penetrate an object. Then it then no longer stands opposed to me, and I've deprived it of that quality of its own, which it had for itself in opposition to me. Yeah. So you are flesh of my flesh and bone of my bone. This is what Adam said to Eve. So does spirit say, this is spirit of my spirit, and its alien character has disappeared. Yep. So in some sense, when we think of something conceptually, we make it fully our own. But there's a problem here, because we make it fully our own, but we lose the thing itself. We end up kind of having this close sexual relation with the representation of the thing, not the thing. So this sort of union is sort of can't really be satisfied. Yeah, the theoretical impulse can't be satisfied without practice. So every representation, a sort of intellectual representation, what today we'd call a concept, is a generalization. And to generalize something means to think it. And when I think something, the I is involved. Yeah, the I is thought likewise, and likewise the universal. When I say I, in this abstract sense, I leave out of account every particularity, such as my character, temperament, knowledge, and age. The I of abstract thought is totally empty. It is merely a point, simple yet active in this simplicity. The colorful canvas of the world is before me. I stand opposed to it, and in this theoretical attitude, I overcome its opposition and make its content my own. But I make its contents my own by, in some sense, the gray on gray of abstract thought. I've got the colorful world, and I make it my own by drawing a kind of black and white sketch in thought. Yep. So I'm at home in the world when I know it, but in some sense, there's going to be something lacking in this purely contemplative, intellectual knowing. Now, we've run out of time. I could just finish the practical, or should I do this next time? I'm a bit behind. Maybe we could talk about this next class. Yeah, so the practical attitude, on the other hand, begins with thought, with the I itself, and seems to be opposed to the world because it immediately sets up a separation. Yeah, and so in some sense, when I take this practical attitude of willing, so insofar I am practical or active, insofar as I act, I determine myself, and to determine myself, it means precisely to posit a difference. So in some sense, in order to act, I have to set myself against the world. There's the world, and then there's my will. Now, but the differences which I posit, so when I act, I always do something specific. But what I do is also mine. The determinations, the things I bring into existence belong to me. And the ends to which I am impelled belong to me. So even if I let go of these determinations and differences, so I decide to do something determinately and act, I posit them, i.e., if I posit them in the so-called external world, they still remain mine. So, you know, when a dog pisses against a tree, it sort of makes the tree himself by pissing on it. When I act in the world, when I make something, when I do something, there's something in the world that I've made mine. They are what I have done or made, and they bear the imprint of my mind. Yeah, so when I act, I start off from the subjective, and I sort of make something objective. And so basically, action is the externalization of the self. The intellect is the internalization of the world. And these are two halves of the same two sides of the same coin. Why don't we come back to this tomorrow, and I'll talk more about this. We've got 5, 6, and 7 to do. We're a little bit behind with Hegel, but that's not a problem. Yeah, we'll have to jiggle things about a bit. So tomorrow we'll carry on talking about theory and practice in Hegel. And this thing about abstraction is sort of setting us up for these two aspects of the will as abstract and the will as particular, and how we have to go beyond them. And the way to combine the abstract and the particular, the best analogy we can give of this, Hegel thinks, is love and friendship. So, yeah, and his earliest work was on Jesus as the principle of love. So the idea of love is really central to his sort of philosophy and to his political philosophy. Yeah, so love and friendship, we understand, because in love and friendship, we give ourselves to another while remaining ourselves. And that's the trick of the absolute. In the absolute, we've fully given out, I mean, we've given ourselves to the world, but we remain ourselves. Yeah, we've got something that is fully external and other, but is ours. So in marriage, he thinks, in love, the other is other. You can't, if you incorporate someone into yourself, that's not love. So in love, the other has to remain other, but has to be a part of you, has to be in some sense, yeah? And here we've got this overcoming of this sort of dichotomy. And this is the kind of felt version of it. But he thinks that in modern life, we've got something similar, because the institutions of the world are ideally institutions we can recognize ourselves in, because they're the expression of human rational activity. It's basically the idea. Okay, I'll see you anon. Okay, bye-bye.
Just a quick question. Will you move on to Putnam in 480? Or will you cover identity theory?
I think I'm going to start talking about identity theory, and then I will maybe talk about Putnam, but I'm not sure if I'll get to Putnam.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. I'll talk about Putnam definitely tomorrow. So tomorrow I'll talk about Putnam and functionalism, and then next Tuesday I'll talk about Ma. And I think that, yeah, so I think one kind of 2-hour session on functionalism in general and Putnam is sort of enough. Yeah. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
I need to run a bit quickly because my computer, I'd be quite happy to sit around, but my computer's almost out of charge. And I think I'm going to have to run to a cafe and charge my computer so I can teach my next class. Okay, bye.